It's finally OTA day for Marvel Snap. We've got a much deserved nerf for the metagame menace that Blob has become inside of the Thanos archetype, as well as buffs to 7 different underutilized cards. Let's go ahead and dig on into the details, shall we? Let's kick things off with the change myself, and I'm sure many of you at home care the most about the adjustment to Blob. Second Dinner has decided they are going to flex the fact that they can change card text in these over-the-air updates now and leverage it to give Blob a new text box. Let's take a look, huh? Blob is now a 6/0 whose on reveal effect says merge cards from your deck into this until it gains 15 or more power. Still, with the ongoing effect, can't be moved. Second starts out their justification for the Blob change by acknowledging that he's been a metagame terror for a good minute, and then going on to say that release valves in the format that typically deal with large cards like this, i.e. Shang-Chi and Shadow King, have not been effective at reining Blob in. That's reflected of my experience playing against this card on the ladder. Even if you're able to kind of have everything go absolutely right against the Blob decks, i.e. you throw a priority going into the last turn, you're still typically guessing which lane the Blob is going to play into, so you can line up your Shang-Chi or Shadow King appropriately. And a lot of the Blob decks have also been playing cards like Armor or Kyeria or even Alioth, so if you do throw a priority, you get punished by other things, meaning your tool isn't even effective even when you manage to win that 50-50, guessing where Blob is going to end up at. Segnator then goes on to talk about how they ended up at this particular iteration for Blob, noting that there were a couple of key gameplay elements they wanted to retain. The first was they wanted to reward eating large amounts of power, especially from high power cards. And the second is they wanted to keep the total power output that Blob was going to have variable for the opponent. This creates tension, and I think overall is a good thing. The problem with Blob's previous design was that his floor tended to be so high it didn't matter that he was variable because the smallest was always way more than big enough. With Blob having a floor of 15 while still having a theoretical ceiling of 34 in the average case scenario, this means there will actually be a meaningful decision in a lot of spots as to how big your opponent's Blob might be and whether or not you can stay or if you should be retreating. Speaking of Blob's power output range, something I wanted to visualize for myself as well as share with all of you at home is exactly what impact this change has on Blob in some of the more common decks that he's currently played. So I put together a quick Python script and I simulated generating 10,000 different Blobs with this new rules text box inside of 3 of the commonly played decks that he's contained in, and these 3 pie charts show us the results. Let's dig into what they mean. The first thing that's obviously worth pointing out is that the largest Blob can now get inside of any given deck is 14 plus the highest power card remaining in your deck, assuming that you hit that highest power card when Blob has exactly 14 points of stats left. What this means is for the current Thanos decks that are currently top end Magneto as a 12 power card as their largest stat stick, Blob's stat ceiling inside of those decks in a perfect situation is now 26 points of power. Similarly, outside of games that involve things like Okoye or other things that power up cards in your deck directly, the Infinaut's going to be the largest thing that you can merge into a Blob. And if you hit that perfect 20 power card when Blob's at 14 points worth of stats, you're only going to get up to 34 as a ceiling, which is still a significantly large number, but it's also significantly smaller than the 50 and 60 point Blobs people were getting previously, and getting that perfect 34 point score is incredibly unlikely. Point of reference, in a traditional 12 card Blob deck like the Living Tribunal ramp deck, you're going to achieve that perfect 34 point Blob only 2.9% of the time, while in comparison in a Thanos deck playing Infinaut that has a larger range of cards that it can be absorbing, you're only going to obtain that perfect 34 point Blob 1.4% of the time. Speaking of how this new Blob behaves in Thanos, the second thing that I think is really important to point out that these charts do a good job of articulating is just how much more consistently Blob is going to be a smaller card inside of the Thanos shell. Specifically inside of the traditional Thanos lockdown shell that, in addition to all the stones, is playing a lot of other low power cards like Professor X and Devil Dinosaur and Blue Marvel. You can expect Blob to be the bare minimum of 15 power almost 30% of the time. Past that, he's only going to get a couple points larger than that minimum 15 points of power another 30% of the time, meaning when this lockdown Thanos deck plays Blob, over half of the time it's going to be 17 points of power or less as the deck is currently constructed. And really, I think this is the best thing about this Blob change overall. It really rewards you for having deck building considerations when you put Blob inside of your deck. While you're still frequently going to be able to get it up to 15 points of power in any Thanos deck, getting it much larger than that consistently is going to require you put a number of larger cards in your deck. We can see here from these charts, both these decks that are playing Living Tribunal tend to have a lot of other large setted things, and they get Blobs past that 17 point of power mark way more consistently than the lockdown Blob variations do, because they have mostly low statted cards individually. Overall, I think this Blob change is really eloquent. It makes it so your deck building with the card matters more. It pulls down the average power output range that the card has while still leaving it with a large amount of power, but not so much that you can't keep up with it with other decks that are also looking to put big numbers on the board. I also think one of the most important things about this change is it gives Second Dinner an easy number to adjust moving forward, where if they feel like Blob is still getting too large too consistently as decks evolve more, they could take that 15 number in his text box and pull it down to 14 or 13, so that way the floor is lower and your odds of ballooning past that get smaller depending on the order of your deck. Moving on from the Blob to the first of our 7 buffs today, we open with the Destroyer gaining back its 16th point of power. Second Dinner notes that this is a reverting to a nerf from the Destroyer for a while ago, because in general, power values over the entirety of the game have gone up a little bit from when they initially took this card and pull it down. They said in general, they're going to be evaluating the relative power of 6-cost cards throughout the remainder of this year, and they expect to make more changes in this area moving forward as they do. Our next change, another small buff to one of my personally favorite cards, that is Viper, who's getting kicked from a 3-4 up to a 3-5. Second Dinner notes that they're a little bit conservative when adjusting Viper over the holidays because they were concerned how she impacted cards like Havoc, as well as a other release in December, Seline. That being said, they want to keep Viper at a 3 cost, but they recognize that her power level is definitely down, so they want to give her an extra stat to try and make up for that. I think Viper fits the mold of 3-5 cards in Marvel Snap quite perfectly. She joins the ranks of Polaris, Spider-Man, Deathlock, and Hulkbuster, which are all cards that have considerable upside under the right circumstances, but they're also awkward and have their on-reveal be a drawback in certain other spots in different games as they progress. Speaking of Seline, she's our next card, getting a pretty sizable buff slash change in this OTA, going from a 1-1 to a 1-2. Second Dinner notes that they originally designed Seline to have explicit combo with Viper and Black Widow, who they obviously adjusted in an OTA in December, meaning that she just hasn't played out that way in practice. Rather than readjusting Viper and Black Widow back down to 2, however, they want to make Seline more flexible by leaving her power positive. And I think this is a good change. This effectively means you're able to play Seline with something like, say, Green Goblin or Hobgoblin and not need to also need extra tools on top of that, such as Viper or Annihilus, to get rid of Seline's body, since she has a positive effect for you wherever she's at on the board. Up next, we have another small buff, this time to Electra, taking her from a 1-1 to a 1-2. Second Dinner notes that they've explored a variety of directions for improving Electra, and they'll likely continue to do so in the future because she's got an amazing story and a lot of great variants, but she is also an early series card that plays an important role teaching new players how to sequence and manage different locations. they said that they want to keep that early play intact while also still giving her a little bit of love. And honestly, I think this is a meaningful change to make. I think there's a chance that in a post-Kyeria world, Electra has a meaningful spot in the metagame, since being able to kill things like Nebula and Sunspot early has value, since a lot of those decks are now playing Kyeria to protect them late, meaning Killmonger isn't just a strictly better Electra anymore, since Electra can be played on curve a lot more efficiently. Continuing with our 1 power buffs, we have Hercules getting buffed in record time up to a 4/7. Secondary notes that Hercules released weaker than they'd like, so they're adding a little bit of power to him. Their goal remains to try and find an execution that builds an interesting move card at 4 cost, because their goal is to diversify strategic options across costs, so that way they have more gameplay variety. They've said they may consider revising the effect in the future if it proves unworkable at the cost, and honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if that has to happen. In my experience playing with Hercules, it just feels really clunky inside of the move decks, because the way move decks tend to play out, you want to play your things like Vultures and Iron Fist and Ghost Spider in those first few setup turns of the game before Hercules comes down, and then by the time you play Hercules, you just don't have enough time to really get your move engine going for him to start triggering. It just doesn't fit into the curve eloquently with what its effect is trying to do. So maybe I'll be wrong and this 4/7 ends up working out, but I was really whelmed by this card in every sequencing move deck that I played. I'd rather it would just be like literally anything else, and I don't really expect 1 more point of power to change that. I've saved what in my opinion are the best 2 buffs for last, with the first one being a sizable one to Dazzler, who's always been underpowered. She is going from a 3/2 down to a 2/2 while retaining her same ongoing effect of getting +2 power for each location that's full on your side. Secondary notes that when they initially buffed Dazzler to 3 energy, they wanted to see if she would fit into Surfer Shells with Brood, and she just hasn't worked out that way and hasn't found a home anywhere else in the metagame. That being said, as a potential 8 power 2 energy card, I think Dazzler has a lot of potential. You know, kind of the above rate 2 energy play is something that gives you 5 points of stats, something like Silk for 2 energy. And if you manage to fill up just 2 lanes, Dazzler is going to beat that being a 2/6. And if you manage to fill the entire board, she's going to be a 2/8, which is solidly above rate. I think they raised the floor on Dazzler very appropriately. Most decks are going to be able to fill up at least 1 location, making her a 2/4. And I think with just a small amount of deck building consideration, she's going to consistently be a 2/6 or a 2/8, which is something that a number of decks are going to be interested in considering for their 2 energy slot. Finally, we close out to a sizable buff to another constant underperformer in Dagger, who will now be a 2/0 with the effect when this moves to a location, get +3 power for each enemy card there. Secondary notes that among move cards, Dagger's been one of the weaker ones for a while, and they like to give some extra competition for that archetype, so they're trying a change that increases her power potential by a good bit. They also go on to note that because Dagger now has 0 base power, she's actually weaker to Shadow King, so this technically isn't a strict upgrade, even if it ends up being more power on average in games that don't involve that specific tech card. I think this is a very acceptable OTA. Blob is obviously much weaker than it was before, while still being a pretty sizable stat stick and likely still one of the biggest 6-drops in the game. That being said, I think it's going to be possible for a number of decks to compete with him in terms of raw stats, as opposed to trying to play a shell game of guess where to put the Shang-Chi or Shadow King and often losing that effect. I'm honestly super excited to see them giving points of power back to things like Destroyer, and acknowledge that they might need to re-examine 6-drops in general, and getting buffs to a variety of other cards that definitely needed them is one of my favorite things about these OTAs. Second Dinner has said moving forward, they're hoping to get back into the previous cycle that we had, where we'll get an over-the-air update, a patch, an over-the-air update, and a week off. In that cycle, this means that next week will be a week off, which puts our next over-the-air update occurring on Thursday, February 1st, once they get some data from where these changes have landed the metagame at. I'm looking forward to getting back to streaming some Marvel Snap on the regular Monday through Friday over on Twitch. Hopefully you'll stop by and join us. As always, thanks for watching all the way through the end of the video. If you enjoyed my musing on this topic, be sure to snap that like button and check back in again tomorrow when we'll have a deck highlight with something fresh from the changes here today.